Cox should not have been on the aircraft. After a mission on August the 2nd, all pilots and co-pilots were given a stern verbal criticism by Colonel O'Neill for not having stayed in tight formation. Major Cox, upset by the comments, stated that he would fly as a command pilot in the lead ship on the mission. Their aircraft was a B-25 Straffer, number 4130118 of the 38th Bomb Squadron. This aircraft arrived at 14-mile strip Port Moresby from the USA, named Elusive Lizzie. And that was quickly changed to Miss America. This was then completely covered up by a large Green Dragon insignia. On their raids, the attacking aircraft would come in behind the mountains and then loop over the summits before diving down on the targets, such as Madang, Leh and Wewak. Research after the war and the testimony of the surviving officer, Major Cox, tells this story. The attack that day against Madang and supply barges consisted of 2 squadrons of ships. Harry led with 3 planes, Gay led the second flight with 4, Pittman with 4, and Garrett Middlebrook last with 3 aircraft. The B-25s would try to come in low on their runs, bombing and strafing simultaneously. They were met with every imaginable ground fire, including ack-ack timed to explode at the aircraft's low altitude. Garrett Middlebrook and the others dived to the deck and, screaming in at 20 feet, bobbed and weaved their way to their targets. They didn't think a direct approach was suitable for their type of low-flying bombing and strafing. Harry's aircraft flew into bursting shells and streams of machine gun tracers crisscrossed in front of the aircraft. Flak from Nagada struck Harry's plane, and flames erupted from the left engine, and fuel from the ruptured gas tank began to burn. The crippled Green Dragon was going down. With its wings level and losing altitude, Captain Harry fought the controls as the crew checked the survival gear ready for impact. As Harry's B-25 pancaked through the waves, Charles McLean, the navigator of the No. 2 wingman, shot off a photograph of it hitting the sea. With his wingmen, Middlebrook completed his sortie and headed out to sea and safety.
That's what I did when we got out of range of the Japanese firepower. I told a young chap named Grover, I said, he was a good pilot, I said, take my flight, circle out here, and go back in and see if I can determine what happened to Cox and his crew. Grover told me not to go because they'd shoot me down, but I went anyhow. And his prediction almost turned out to be correct. I received a lot of firepower.
Survivors were seen swimming strongly by the crew of Middlebrook's aircraft towards Wongat Island. Major Cox said after the war,
"Flak set one engine on fire. The blaze spread to the tanks. We hit the water at 160 miles an hour, ricocheted or skipped along at 80 miles an hour. All but one of the crew got clear of the plane. The Japanese were just standing, waiting for us. Having been bombing them a few minutes earlier, we didn't expect much better than to end up in their dinner stew."
The crew were taken to the Japanese headquarters at Amron for interrogation, except for Zimmerman, who was killed in the crash, and Ritako, who managed to hide on the island. He later swam to Panatibun, where he slept in the Lutheran church. Today, the church no longer stands, as it was destroyed by the Japanese. The remnants are now part of the local cemetery. The next morning, Ritako swam to Riwo village, where he was eventually captured and imprisoned with the rest of the crew. Later at Amron, the crew were handed over to the Kempeitai, the Japanese secret military police. During brutal interrogation, the crew refused to answer questions concerning military information. Later, Cox was removed from his cell and informed he was to be moved to Rabaul. He was taken to the Alexishafen airstrip, tied to a coconut tree, and left there for 4 days. He never saw any of the crew again. On the 5th day, Cox was flown to Rabaul in a bomber, and he expected one of the American fighter patrols to shoot them down at any time. He spent 8 months in Rabaul before being shipped to Japan in a freighter. Major Cox found out later that being on board a ship to Japan was not an ideal place to be if American submarines were close by. In September 1944, a wolf pack consisting of USS Pampanito, USS Growler and USS Sea Lion II, on station in the South China Sea, proceeded to attack a convoy and sank the Rakuyo Maru and the Kachadoki Maru, among others. Unknown to the submarine skippers, these 2 vessels carried over 2,000 British and Australian prisoners of war. Later, the Pampanito, which was surface patrolling, discovered a crude raft with men clinging to it. Amid the shouting and waving, an English voice was heard. The crew was stunned to find out they were British and Australian prisoners of war from the Rakuyo Maru, sunk 4 days earlier. The Pampanito radioed Sea Lion for assistance. The rescue became a race against time. As the oil-coated and half-conscious men were brought on board, they were stripped and had most of the crude oil removed. The men were then given a cloth moistened with water to suck on. As soon as was possible, the survivors were passed down into the after torpedo room. Some were in a very bad shape due to years of imprisonment and 4 days on a raft. When unable to squeeze in any more survivors, the 2 submarines headed at full speed for Saipan. The Pampanito had rescued 73 and the Sea Lion 54. Radio silence was broken to inform ComSubPac of the rescue, and that many more survivors could still be out there. 2 submarines, the Barb and the Queenfish, were asked to render assistance. After a dangerous dash of 724 kilometers, both arrived in the survivor search area. Between them, they recovered 32 prisoners of war. The submarines remained on the surface for 24 hours, and after believing that no survivors could last on any raft, they stopped the search, battened down, and headed for Saipan. On arrival at Saipan, all but the most seriously ill of the survivors were permitted topside, and they were barely distinguishable from the submarine crews due to the clothing supplied by the sailors. The survivors provided details in regards to the horrors and atrocities of the Burma-Thailand Railway, and how, after the sinking of the ships, the prisoners in the water were held at bay by guns, as Japanese were picked up by the escorts. When Major Cox's vessel arrived in Japan, he was imprisoned in Tokyo. The Japanese wanted to be sure he was thoroughly interrogated.